You're listening to Gender, a Wider Lens.
I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States. Since 2016, my practice has been exclusively dedicated to gender-questioning teens and families impacted by gender dysphoria.
I also work with gender-questioning teenagers, and I facilitated support meetings for families and individuals who've been impacted by gender issues.
We're curious about the concept of gender and how it's unfolding in the wider culture.
Join us as we look at gender through a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
Hi, Sasha.
So today we're covering some interesting topics around gifted and exceptional traits in young people. I think we've both anecdotally observed that a lot of young people who have gender dysphoria or have detransitioned just kind of intuitively strike us as being incredibly intelligent. And we'll start by looking at this idea of giftedness, which, as we were preparing for the episode, Stella, you said that's a uniquely American concept. So tell me a little bit about how do these traits show up in Ireland, and how do you guys conceptualize exceptional learners, let's say?
We tend not to in Ireland. If somebody's a very bright kid, it wouldn't really get commented on, and it wouldn't get identified, and it certainly wouldn't get tested, and you wouldn't get put into special classes. Now, the parent might run around kind of talking about it, or the parent might secretly hold it to themselves, but it wouldn't be said. Now, that could be just Irish kind of self-deprecating kind of attitudes that we often have here, but we don't have a system whereby the gifted kids are identified early and challenged academically so that they can reach their potential at an early age. Even further than that, when I was a kid, let's say in the 80s, I would have been maybe 13 in 88 or something like that. When I was a kid, you did get put into A, B, and C classes at 13. And the A class were academic, the B class were, average, and the C class were challenged academically. But now that would be considered very, very old hat. It would be considered a very old-fashioned way of viewing children's academics. And so now nobody gets divided. You do higher level or ordinary level, but that would be at 15. So we've really pushed it off, and no 10-year-old is getting pointed out unless they're Einstein or unless there's a mother who's very interested in getting them tested. Nowadays, if somebody says gifted, anybody Irish would hear American, an American style of parenting, an American style of pushiness, an American style of obsession with categorization, an American style of intervention. There's an awful lot of Americanization, and it is very much creeping into parenting in Ireland. There's no doubt about it. And so It's said more in the last 5 years than it was ever said before, but it would still be considered, I'd be interested if listeners want to tell me different, but it would be considered mostly an American concept that's coming over.
Yeah.
But can you tell me what is going on? Because I don't understand it. People, I meet Americans who say they're gifted and they were put into special classes, and this is at young ages, and my jaw hits the ground because I think the pressure on these kids. So what is the situation? How does it happen?
Yeah, this is just reminding me of the exceptionalism that we see around certain types of traits, that they're special and that they cannot be understood like a typical child. And while I hear you have some reservation about that, I also think it can be valuable to recognize that a young person is learning in a way that is perhaps different, that perhaps sets them up with special kinds of needs. To be honest, you asked me about what is going on there. I'm not an expert. I also don't have children, right? So I can only share with you what I know as a therapist, as a counselor. But in America, there seems to be a certain kind of cohort of parents that is interested in getting their child tested for giftedness. I don't think this is an across-the-board American thing. I've worked with, different populations that are perhaps more working class, and nobody's getting their kids tested for giftedness, in my experience, in like working class or lower income families.
That makes more sense.
Though there are lots of kids who are quite exceptional that I've met that come from backgrounds like that. To me, they're clearly exceptional, but their parents are just not thinking about it that way. But in my experience, educated parents who come from a certain kind of middle upper class educated background, they're the ones who have it on their radar to start assessing pretty young their kids' abilities, and they're looking at milestones and they're trying to figure out if their child is reading at a younger age than others. Like there's a little more, well, maybe a lot more deliberate and intentional focus on the child's academic abilities and their learning abilities. So in families like that, I think parents are much more likely to seek out testing and assessments and evaluations to kind of rank their kid and understand where their child is at.
But there seems to be some sort of system within the schools that if the child is assessed as gifted, they will go into a special class of other gifted kids.
Yeah, I think this is true. I mean, I'm not sure. I know that there are certain schools that will have special programs. So there'll be programs for special ed, which can include a combination of a lot of different diagnoses. So a child with autism, a child with a learning disability, ADHD, or even a gifted child might all end up in the same kind of program, where the idea is to tailor and individualize the educational curriculum and program to meet the child at their pace and what their needs are. There are also kind of small private schools here in the US that are geared towards kids with exceptional learning abilities or learning disabilities. And so you can find pockets of schools where kids are kind of insulated with other supposedly similar peers. But again, I think this is not true for all American families, but the ones who are assessing their kids for this, they can end up sending them on a specific kind of trajectory from a really young age. And of course, schools will have specific programs within the larger school setting for gifted kids or exceptional kids or kids who are assessed in this way.
I think it's fascinating how many children with gender dysphoria seem to be gifted. There seems to be an extraordinary correlation going on here. And I'd like us to explore that in this episode. But I do also think that the more we categorize everybody, the more, oppressive it is for everybody. And I really think at a young age, identifying a child as gifted might be helpful, but it could also be a burden for a lot of children. So I'm leery of it. I'm not really into it. I think the freedom to be a kid should be protected. And I think specialize later, if at all possible. Just from a psychological point of view, I'm not sure that identifying that burden of early promise, I think it's a heavy burden. I think it's a heavy burden. And I know as a kid, I was identified as clever, because that's how you'd be identified. There'd be no assessments, but clever kid. But I remember I was a clever kid, and it's a sad story. I knew I was clever, but I feared I wasn't as clever as other people thought I was, which is a very common dynamic among clever kids. And they often say a sign of being clever is thinking you're not as clever as, because you realize how much there is to learn. So, little did I know. But I knew I was clever. I knew people thought I was clever, and I feared I wasn't that clever. And there was an entrance exam for the school I wanted to go to. And I was freaking out about it silently, because I thought, they all think I'm going to be brilliant, top of the class, 100%, and maybe I'm not. And nobody will know it. Because up until that, I'd gone to an unusual school. I'd gone to an Irish-speaking school, so I was out of things. And I thought, this is my first test, 12 years old. And you know what? This is a horrible story. I bottled it. I didn't go. I said I didn't want to go to school. Nobody questioned it. And I ended up going to a dreadful school. I know, for the next 5 years.
When you say I bottled it for all of us.
I said about 3 days. Sorry. It means I chickened out.
You just never took it.
About 3 days before the exam. It was weighing heavily on me, 12 years old. Just saying nothing to nobody, because 12-year-olds keep their secrets. They don't even know their secrets. They don't even know they're chickening out. Do you know what I mean? They don't know. I was all over the place. Anyway, very much this is the burden of early promise, very much identified as clever, and it weighed heavily on me. And I didn't take the test and ended up going to a school that very badly didn't suit me. Was out of my neighbourhood because I missed the main school because I didn't go. I said I didn't want to go to school about 3 days before the exam. Horrible, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of sad, and it's true that once you have that label put on you, a whole host of complicated psychological processes kick off. You know, even if you had owned that label, then there's the kind of embarrassment of claiming that you are more intelligent than other kids, and that can be a terrible feeling. I mean, there's no easy way to be labeled as gifted. Whether you like the label or you don't like the label, I mean, it's messy. So I really hear that. And I do think that kids can kind of get set up with this expectation that they're going to be exceptional all the time. And then, you know, that can lead to this perfectionism whereby I'm like, well, what about when the kid just wants to be a normal kid and kind of irresponsible sometimes? You know, teenagers need to have moments of, not being perfect. And so I think that label can exacerbate the traits that young people who are exceptional already have, which is wanting to be exceptional, wanting to learn as much as they can, wanting to be intelligent, wanting to score well. So, you know, it's not always a bad idea to assess a child and get them the support they need, but we're just lifting up that this is really complicated and it does come with all kinds of baggage. And I wonder too, I mean, I know this isn't a big deal in Ireland, but what about the parental psychology, right, of parents who have a gifted child or they're interested in their child's giftedness? Do they talk about that with other parents? How does that end up playing out in their relationships with other
parents? Oh, that happens in Ireland.
Oh, it does?
It's not gifted, though. Not mostly. Clever? It's called clever. Yeah. We're very prone to that.
I think of clever being like a cunning fox. I don't think clever. Maybe that's my American interpretation. Like Stella, like sneaky.
Sylvester Fox. Why do you think gender dysphoria and giftedness are linked? What is your thesis there?
I have tons of theories about this. I guess I will start out by saying when we say giftedness in America, it seems like as I was researching this topic, there's not one standardized definition of what that even means. So we have another concept creep situation. I get the impression, and any listeners who know more about this can certainly, you know, fill us in, but I get the impression that historically being considered gifted was an IQ score above 130. And I think in more recent times, you know, educational specialists have expanded this to talk about exceptionalism in different kinds of domains of learning, of synthesizing information. And even I know that there are people who study giftedness in like a physical way. So gifted athletes, for example, like exceptional physical abilities or exceptional musical abilities. So the word gifted can mean a lot of different things. But just to kind of ground us in a little bit of data, there are a couple studies that might help us answer your question. So one study that was done on gifted college students, it was, I think, 118 gifted college students in 2009, used something called the Ben Sex Role Inventory. And this is an inventory that assesses masculinity and femininity. So, of course, we're talking about stereotypes. But these gifted kids took this sex role inventory, and they found that gifted students tend to be more androgynous in their behavior. So they actually do exhibit more, you know, cross-sex role-based behaviors than people who maybe are not gifted. And in Dr. Lisa Littman's parental report survey of adolescent onset gender dysphoria, she found that 47% were tested gifted, and another 10% were tested as both gifted and having a learning disability. So it seems like, just from looking at some of these numbers, that people who are androgynous or people who are gifted are more likely to be androgynous. And a lot of the rapid onset gender dysphoria kids do have a gifted label. So I mean, one of the big things to me that really stands out is gifted people are really intellectually curious and willing to think outside of the box. They like complicated ideas, they like intellectual challenges, and the more I learn about, youth culture, ROGD beliefs, and gender identity, it is a very complicated set of ideas. And I think that that's intellectually tempting for young, gifted kids who kind of like that intellectual puzzle. They're very cerebral. And I just feel like there's something about that way of thinking differently than their peers that really comes naturally for gifted kids.
I wonder about that androgyny in that study. Why would intelligent kids be more inclined to androgyny? My kind of brain keeps on just linking on that, but why? Why would they be more androgynous? Is it that they reject stereotyping behavior? Is it that they reject norms, saying, why should I wear something if it's not comfortable? Is it?
I think it is. I mean, I think that highly intelligent kids tend to kind of march to their beat of their own drum in a way. And so, whereas, perhaps, this is again just a guess, but perhaps whereas another child might be very, very willing to copy and imitate their peers in order to fit in, maybe a highly exceptional or gifted kid is willing to do something kind of different or unique or, not necessarily blend in perfectly well with the other kids. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they're used to being a little bit different. So they're not so easily falling in anyway. And so that they're not in the group as much as other people feel part of the group. They're used to being on their own. So they start suiting themselves that little bit more anyway, because so therefore, but I think I fear we're missing something. I fear that there's an added thing, because while that it doesn't feel very satisfying as a theory, it doesn't feel comprehensive. It feels like there's more.
Oh, well, there's a lot more to it. I don't think we hit on the whole thing. Well, for sure, kids who are gifted also start asking these huge existential questions very early.
Yeah.
And I think they feel sometimes kind of this existential depression and angst.
Yes.
That can be very powerful around adolescence.
Yes.
So while they see their peers just being kind of flippant and having a good time of it and getting boy crazy or whatever, these are kids who are really grappling with huge life questions that are not easily satisfied. And I think they get kind of depressed. I mean, I do think a lot of gifted people really struggle during these transitional periods of life. So, is that depression also exacerbated by the fact that they don't necessarily fit in well with others? Like, I've talked to so many families, Stella, who say, my kid has always been kind of unique and has been tested gifted, and they were in a school where they really didn't fit in.
Yeah.
And then we switched them to a school with lots of other kids like them, and they blossomed and they just made friends after so many years of feeling like an outcast. So, I mean, I know that during the adolescent years, your friendships matter a lot. And if you feel alone, it's very, very hard. So I think, like, if you imagine you're grappling with the existential questions of life, you're feeling really lonely, and you start to build like relationships with other young people online who kind of have similar interests. I mean, I think that kind of trio can explain at least part of it.
It explains online trans identification and finding a community and seeking a community for starters, and then finding a community. It does explain that. It doesn't really explain that the study was a 2011 of the androgyny. Do you understand?
Yeah.
It doesn't quite explain that. It explains
the 2009 study.
Yeah, that's the thing I'm kind of still going back to, and it's so noticeable. But also, I would say what lifts up for me is, ASD and autism spectrum. That is very linked with androgyny and just basically not seeing the social norms of why you should wear that clothes or those shoes, and then also not buying into them. You know what I mean? And also, when you're gifted, and I think you've spoken very eloquently on this before, you can be very intense and very sensitive. And if you're intense and sensitive, you are inclined to not wear clothes that are uncomfortable. And you have your clothes that are purely on the basis of they don't annoy me, these clothes. And that's why I wear them. And I don't care what they look like. Get away from me. I'm thinking bigger thoughts anyway. So all of that makes me think why gifted kids might be androgynous might be because they're just going for clothes for different reasons than other people.
Yeah.
Is that what androgyny is? Is that just purely your clothes and your hair, I wonder?
Yeah. I think some of it is also behaviors. I'd have to look at the inventory more closely to answer that, but I think that's definitely getting closer. I think that's probably right. And I'm also thinking about, let's just take an example to ground us in something a little more concrete. Let's say you have an adolescent boy who is, coming of age. He's 13, 14, 15. And the way boys in his peer group gain like status is by being kind of tough or making certain types of jokes about girls or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
A gifted kid who is, let's say, more, I guess, justice oriented or deep. A little more deep. Yeah. He might say, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not going to violate my values to fit in. Like, I think that ability to hold fast to one's own values, to stay true to yourself, like maybe that's something that highly intelligent or exceptional people are more willing to do. I don't know. But I'm just thinking like the desire to conform may be just managed differently for kids who are exceptional. And, that's also to point out, I think it can be very lonely to be a gifted kid, whether you have the label or not, even if you're just quirky and you just don't kind of have the same interests as other teenagers. Like I know kids who they're much more interested in like, cross-cultural anthropology and like learning about something from like German history than they are about TikTok videos or something, so even if you don't have the label, if your interests just make you an outlier, you may not be willing to conform, but it doesn't mean you aren't lonely. I think a lot of the kids who find themselves isolated like this have a really hard time finding their group and fitting in and having like meaningful, rich friendships, which they crave.
For me, that's the biggest issue. The biggest issue for somebody who is intelligent, gifted, whatever you want to call it yourself, the loneliness and the isolation of that person can't be understated, and it wallops at around about 11 or 12. Because up until then, you can kind of go with the games and you can kind of, you can get distracted. You can, and then existential thought, depth, you're going deeper than other people. You're asking questions. You're being noticed for being different. And, children, there's nothing more conforming than children. And they don't like difference, and it's kicking in hard and fast. It might kick in a little bit younger, but it's very much an issue. And the loneliness of being very intelligent, I don't know how we can manage that. You know what I mean? That these kids do need to find their groups. They do need to find their peers. And so therefore they should have opportunities. And yet we have to balance that with the burden of saying, you're intelligent and therefore you need to find your peers. This is, adolescence is so tricky because by the time you're 25, you've figured out you're clever and you've met your clever friends. But until then, you're all over the place. You know what I mean?
If you're lucky at 25, well, yeah, I feel like in our generation.
If you're me, you're 46.
Your clever fox friends.
Yeah, that's you, Sasha.
Yeah, okay, that's me. But I think in our generation, I don't know why, anecdotally, it just felt easier to make friends, I think. I know a lot of young people today have a hard time socially connecting with each other. And so I wonder if by 25, most young people today have met their group. I don't know if they have.
I remember the relief of meeting somebody who kind of got me. Do you follow me? Intellectually, I got him and he got me. I was about 17. Well, I was 17. It was life-changing. It was like suddenly getting into the water, having been on dry land all my life. It was incredibly profound.
Yeah.
And so when you do meet somebody after being isolated all your life, it can hit very, very heavy and very hard. And if that happens to be an online community who are awash with theories and concepts and complicated ideas, I could just imagine you're just swimming along going, give me more, let me think about this, let me discuss this. And frankly, I don't want to talk about the transphobic ticks all around me. I want to go to my community.
Yeah, that's right.
I can so see how they just suddenly think, these are my people and I've no interest in anybody else.
Yeah. I think another thing, you talked about 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Another thing that I think starts to happen around like late elementary school is that schools will start to split kids up by sex. Boys over here, girls over here, or whatever. And I think the highly deep thinking kids, they immediately notice that and they feel kind of weird about it. Again, that kind of philosophical question of like, why are we doing this? Why are boys and girls being treated differently? Whereas maybe other kids don't even bat an eye about it. So there's a lot of stuff that starts to happen around that age, including the isolation that we talked about in the social struggle. And, I read a really interesting book called Living with Intensity. And it's about this trait of, it's almost like a physiological trait of your nervous system reacting stronger and taking in more from the environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about this theory, but one of the things I remember reading was that intense kids crave really deep relationships. So they're also dissatisfied with superficial relationships that are very common in teenagehood. Teenagers can be quite petty and quite flip about things. So these deep kids, they want intense, dramatic, real relationships where they can get into these questions about life. And that's hard to find. I mean, it's generally hard to find, especially hard to find at that age.
And you know what? In other generations, they found each other through the music they liked. They really did. And it's really noticeable to me. I used to, tutor kids in different languages and stuff like that. And a common question to prepare them for the language exams was, what music do you like? What films do you like? Things like that. Tell me about yourself. And then I noticed the kids had very little to say about music. So we're talking about 2000 to 2010. And I noticed music is just not a feature in teenagers' life. It's sliding away as a feature. And now it's just throwing. Music is like, what's your favorite color? They've just so little to say about music. Well, I would have talked for months about music. I had so much to say about music. And I think a lot of the depth that you can find in the lyrics of songs, you move to poetry, you move to novels, you move to literature from music. You start in music and you move and you find your depth in the arts. And I really think therapy doesn't quite bring in art enough. It doesn't. When I say art in the larger sense, it doesn't bring in music and books and all the nourishment which frankly kept me alive in my teenage years. I just think we're missing it, man. We got to get it all in.
I feel lucky because a lot of the young kids I work with are still deeply engaged with music and with art. And I think that's such a lifesaver. And, one of the things I've often thought about with, the question of like whether or not to get a child assessed for giftedness or whether or not to put them in a gifted program, I've often said to parents, the goal should be to connect your child with other deep interests and not to spin circles around the giftedness label.
Oh, nice.
If your child develops a kind of superiority complex about being gifted, you've missed the point. The point is other gifted kids are going to find passions that they want to talk about and teach each other about and interesting hobbies they can build together. That's the point. If you're going to do it, it's for that reason. It's not so that you can sit on a pedestal and like brag about your gifted child, right? So I think you're totally right that having a deep curiosity and passion for creative ventures and interests. And this applies to the science kids too. I mean, these brilliant kids who develop, brand new video games because of their coding abilities. I mean, this intelligence is also translating as we become a more technological world. So the kids who are exceptional are now applying some of that to technology. And it's incredible what they do. And if a kid can find other peers like them that have these kinds of interests that take up such a big place in their mind, like their energy for life, that's why I think people should pursue this diagnosis, or I guess this assessment.
My slight worry about that, I hear you and I'm nodding along, but my worry is that art, music, books, at the risk of sounding like a dinosaur, there's a depth to them that art brings. And I worry, an existential depth and richness that I think the gifted child needs, that depth. I worry, even though I don't know enough about video games to really have a view, I worry that it's not as existentially rich. It's beautiful and it's technical and it feels more scientific. And I know there is very much a place for talented people to be scientific and technical, but I actually think they need the depth that the arts bring.
Yeah.
I really do. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things, I have a lot of kids that I work with who know a lot about video games. So by proxy, I've learned a lot. Not nearly as much as, some of these young people, but something that I've realized is that certain types of games are really achievement oriented. And it's all about leveling up, right?
Yeah.
You have a kid who already has a tendency towards perfectionism and self-assessment constantly. Spending a lot of time in these games only makes that worse. And I do think it has a way of disconnecting us from more existential questions that are not just about earning points and ranking up and up and up.
Yeah, there's a great professor, Carol Dweck from Stanford. Do you know her? Professor of psychology. And she spent her life's work, well, a lot of it, studying why do some people with great potential go to great heights, like Barack Obama or whoever, and why do some people with great potential, equally great potential, choke? And what is the difference between these two? And she studied it in depth, and she basically identified their mindset as being the key difference. And some people have a growth mindset, and some people have a fixed mindset. And if you have a growth mindset, you're able to handle failure. You realize that you're always growing, you're always developing, and when you get a failure, you're like, what did I miss here? What do I need to improve? You know what I mean? And Bill Gates said it. He said it's fine to celebrate our successes, but it's more important to learn the lessons of failure. Well, I'm not saying he's this great, but he's obviously a very intelligent man, and you can see there's a man with a growth mindset. Now, a fixed mindset is you think you have a fixed intelligence or talent. So it could be soccer, it could be maths, it could be video games. And if you have that mindset, then you have to defend it and nurture it, and everything, all your eggs are in that basket. And the day you hit failure on that, you kind of collapse in on yourself because you think, I thought I was good at maths and I got a bad exam, and now my entire house of cards has collapsed. So nurturing a growth mindset in somebody is really important. When you're clever, like I was with my fixed mindset at 12, I was pure fixed. And I thought, rather than doing the test, I will avoid the test because I don't want to confront whether I might have weaknesses. And I think very intelligent people can feel like that, and it's a real issue, and it's something to be very wary around. Now, put that into somebody who is achievement-oriented, who's kind of perfectionistic, who knows that they're clever, and then throw in the trans kind of phenomenon that's going on online. Then they want to be the most perfect trans person. They want to kind of identify imperfection. They want to go through all the things, and they want to do them as fast as possible because they don't want any shoddy version, because they've already identified themselves as exceptional, so they have to be exceptionally trans. They can't be a little bit trans identified. They have to go all the way because that's their mindset. And I think it's really, really dubious and dangerous mindset to have. But anyway, her book is called Mindset. It's a really good book. I'd recommend it.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes, definitely. I mean, one of my favorite phrases to use in therapy is you are in a process. You are in a process. Nobody starts out great at something that they've been doing for 5 minutes, And I think that desire to kind of reach mastery level really quickly is very common. And I've seen that in a lot of my exceptionally brilliant young people. And it can be crippling. It can put you in a position to where I'd rather not start at all or not try at all.
Yeah.
Unless I can be perfect at it. And that's a paralyzing mindset.
Yeah. This fear of failure, if you want to know whether you have a fear of failure or whether you're, very driven by ambition, it's quite easy to figure it out just for people to know. A fear of failure, basically on the day of the exam or on the day of the big test or the competition, you're kind of vomiting in the waste paper basket. You're very intense and nervous. Afterwards, you're full of exuberance and you're thrilled with yourself. But beforehand, you are not in a good place. While if you're just driven by ambition, on the day of the exam, you're like Muhammad Ali. Come on, bring it out. I'm going to show everybody how fabulous I am. You're on and up because I'm on. I'm on. This is my strength. You know what I mean?
I think I have that to a fault because a lot of times I would think that I was going to kick ass on an exam and I would be so excited to take it, and then the grade would come back and it would be so bad.
That's so sweet.
So whatever dial I have is like accidentally cranked up.
But I think we need to be aware that so many children come to me, and I've no doubt come to you, and they are bent backwards by their fear of failure. They are absolutely, this is a huge, big issue in today's generation, to an extent that when I give a lot of talks in schools and stuff, every single time I talk of a fear of failure, hands shoot up. Every single time I mention it in a talk, people come up to me afterwards, how do you get over fear of failure? Fear of failure. It's huge. And Carol Dweck said, people, a notable lot of children are being raised to be slaves of praise. And so what started as a lovely movement in America in the 1980s of praising children and raising their self-esteem has led to children being completely slaves to it and reliant on it and always seeking external validation rather than having the very pleasant and profound gift of self-evaluation where you know when you nailed something and you know when you didn't. And that's a really lovely thing to kind of nurture in a kid. And it won't, just in case parents are having a freak out if they're listening to us, it won't be done in a year. You give yourself time to kind of re-nurture it in your kids. You address the fear of failure. I personally think it should be mentioned that somebody has a fear of failure rather than pretending this is all ambition and this is all hard driven, that it's actually more satisfying on your soul if you say, you might have a fear of failure here and we might need to kind of help ourselves out with this because it can be very much a heavy burden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can get people very stuck. I mean, you can't move forward if you're afraid of the next step.
Yeah.
I want to shift a little bit to talk about this concept of overexcitability, which is something that is probably also American. I mean, it was, I think, first coined by, I believe he's Polish, a psychologist researcher named Kazimierz Dabrowski, and he identified these kind of 5 domains by which, again, he says this is like a nervous system thing. 5 domains by which people just have disproportionately large intakes. And those 5 domains are psychomotor, which has to do with our physical kind of self in space, emotional overexcitability, sensual, having to do with the senses. You kind of alluded to this with the clothing and the comfort, intellectual overexcitability, and imaginal overexcitability, which again probably relates to that creativity, the art, the music. But there are these 5 areas where, I think a lot of young gifted kids, when you start to think about them through the lens of these 5 domains, you can really identify where those kids might be overexcitable. And I wonder if you have heard of this concept. Are you familiar with this? Maybe we could just talk a little bit about this.
I've heard it mentioned, but I haven't studied it well, but I know it well insofar as I see it with the clients very often, and it's something that comes up again and again and again. The overexcitability, it feels like we're living in a very overexcitable world, and I think it's definitely being exacerbated by the online. And that, it was constructed by psychologists, and the Social Dilemma is a great film, and I really recommend anybody who's listening to watch it, to give us a kind of an example of how it can lead us to excitability for no other reason than there's huge multi-billion companies who want likes and shares, and so they lead us to overexcitability. So that's the one that I'm most concerned about, because I think it's the one that's the tail is wagging the dog, and the overexcitability is wagging us all over the place at the moment and leading us to, I don't know, storm Capitol Hill or whatever,
I guess which domain would you think that is, or can you describe what you mean? Like, how is it making us more overexcitable?
I think it's leading a heightened atmosphere online. The reason why we've got a heightened atmosphere is that the social networks are checking into, they're kind of, what's the word? They're clued into our emotional brains, because they know that's where they will get more shares, more likes, more traction. And I think psychologists have studied this, very clever psychologists have studied this, so that their companies, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is, or Snapchat, will get the most traction. And so they've been actually constructed to make us excitable and to get our
emotionally.
Yeah.
Emotionally excitable.
And that great line terrible line from journalist school, which is, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
And I remember they did this amazing study in Canada of this Toronto, I think it was the Toronto Star. It was certainly a newspaper, and they realized that every single day, maybe it wasn't Toronto Star, correct me if I'm wrong, and they realized that every single day the paper had led with a murder, which was strange, because there hadn't been a murder every single day in that year in that city. And they studied it, and they realized, oh my God, what's happened here is they've gone out of the district to get the murder in, to get the front page, because that's how you sell more papers. Now expand that into the social networks, and that's how they are getting us. They're bringing us in with high emotion and shocking stories, and everything is on that heightened level. And then a heightened, isolated 13-year-old checks into social media and just sees, whoa, this is just an emotional storm, and off they go on a roller coaster.
Well, I mean, one of the emotional overexcitability traits is just having really extremes of emotions, which, I mean, that's also very typical for adolescence. We all went through that. And, one of the things that having an emotional overexcitability can do is it can make you feel very different from others. I mean, I think all of these excitabilities, when you look at how they manifest, they can make a young person feel very, very different. And I hear over and over again from clients that the main kind of reason that they know they have gender dysphoria or that they're trans is that they just feel so different. And so anything that is experienced by the person, which makes them an outlier, is going to be one of those kind of proof points in someone's mind. Even if technically all of the emotional or all of the teenagers around you are also highly emotional, you just feel like you're too much, you're over the top, you are experiencing more than others. And so it just makes you feel convinced that nobody else is quite like you.
Yeah. And they feel that all that difference can be contained with one solution, that they were born in the wrong body. And that's why they feel odd and different and unusual and wrong and don't fit in and all the other things. I think it's such a seductive concept, and it could be the root of an awful lot of people who feel trans-identified, when actually they could have identified with feeling different. And if there was a new wave of I feel different, and if that took over the internet, I feel odd, I feel different, nobody's like me, nobody feels like me, nobody acts like me, that would be much more productive.
Well, let's look at some of the other excitabilities too, because I think they're really interesting. So in imaginal overexcitability, this might look like excessive daydreaming, detailed visualization, having imaginary friends, lots of fantasy. And again, that kind of sensitivity to music, poetry, drama, things like that. So if you have these types of traits, you're also able to kind of fantastically project yourself into your new identity in your mind. So even though you have a female body, you spend all this time just visually imagining yourself as a guy. And I hear a lot of kids like this who are artists, they're visual artists.
Yeah.
And they spend so many hours of their week immersed in anime and imagery and drawings and gay male fantasy stories.
Yeah.
And they become completely enamored and wrapped up in this fantasy world in their mind because their imaginal abilities are so strong.
Yeah. And they spend, we all whiled away, and it was really interesting. I whiled away hours and hours and thousands of hours imagining myself with various boys and just basically stalking in my mind various boys in my teenage years, right? And I remember thinking, where would all these hours be if I was thinking more productive thoughts? I'd imagine a lot of teenagers do that. And I'd imagine that the children who have gender dysphoria and who might identify as trans and stuff, that's where they're imagining it. All those thousands of hours I spent imagining what the boy was doing, where he was, what he was going to say, what I was going to say, what he'd say then, has gone into that fantasy life. And in this life, it's like, and we have to bring in the fact that an awful lot of children have been brought up in this Disney world where if you wish hard enough and if you imagine it and all, remember The Secret, and Rhonda Byrne brought out that book. And, if you just, ask the universe and just, it will come. You just have to believe hard enough. And you bring The Secret and that whole concept and bring that into Disney and wishing upon a star. And, the good guy always wins. And if you just think about it, you'll get it. And so they spend all these hours imagining, creating, drawing, thinking about their future. To rip that away from them feels heart-wrenching. But I do wonder, did most teenagers spend thousands of hours somewhere off in their head? Because I certainly did.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time just in imagination and fantasy. I mean, I think my sensitivities, whatever we want to call them, are less in the imaginal realm. I mean, I really relate to the psychomotor excitability. I'm someone who cannot sit still. Everything to me comes through the body. My senses, my physical perception, my senses. I've done like so many different kinds of dance and sports and all these things. So I really relate to that. And just to think a little bit about stereotypes, I mean, if we're going to just talk about how a lot of kids diagnose themselves with gender dysphoria. If you have a girl who's physically competitive and kind of impulsive, which is really ADHD type traits here, and can't sit still, nervous habits, reckless in her speech, like all of these things might make a girl feel like she's not really that girly. If we think that girls are quiet and timid and demure and like sit still in the same place. I mean, I've even heard people critique the way education systems move in the direction that is typically more, quote, geared towards girls, that like there's not as much physical play and activity. And I say I can't relate to that because I can't sit still ever. I mean, I've never been a quiet girl that just sits there. So, if a young person does have these psychomotor overexcitabilities, might she feel very different from her female peers, or might she feel like that's not typical, quote, girly behavior?
And where should somebody go if they have psychomotor excitability? Should they get into
the amusement park? They should go to the amusement park.
Were you really into dance, and would you recommend it as get into something physical?
Well, I mean, I think the world of movement is so huge and broad, and we're going to do an episode all about the body these days. But I think people just have to find what speaks to them. I mean, there are some people who end up, really into climbing, and they will do rock climbing, and they'll be outdoors and hiking and that kind of thing. And other people, I mean, I connect very strongly with music. So for me, dance is a perfect physical activity. I do lots of other physical activities too, but there's so many senses being used when you are dancing because it's both physical and auditory and emotional. There's a lot there. Lots of girls, were, and boys too, of course, but, into sports and team sports or running track. I mean, there are so many ways to express ourselves through our body. So I don't know if there's one particular place a person should go, but if you have a lot of physical energy, I worry that some kids are expending that through gaming and not actually through physical play. And you can't like hardwire, or I guess you can't rewire that energy into your fingers and gaming because you crave physical stimulation. Like you need to actually physically get that out of your body. So I think that's interesting.
I think you've lifted up a really interesting topic. My first book was called Cotton Wool Kids, and it really studied the impact of how many children are living an indoors life and, the organic, prison. And it's a cotton wool life, you know what I mean? And they're inside an awful lot, and they're on their screens. And this COVID generation, even more so. And those physical kids are particularly prone, I think, towards the games because they've got some sort of, I don't know, physical...
Like a restlessness?
Yes. And the frankly Machiavellian psychologists behind the video games are saying, yeah, bring them over. We'll get your physical kids and we'll make them monsters on video games. I know there's some great beauty in video games and I know you can't write it all off, but I do really worry about the screen-based childhoods children are having. And I honestly think childhood is getting worse. I don't think it's getting more fun. I think it's limping at this stage. It's not as fun as it would have been. And I know people would say, yeah, but it's safer. And I'm like, yeah, but we have to balance because just because it's safe, you want to stay safe. You bring your kids up in a padded room, throw them screens, and that's safe. And then suddenly it's not safe because it's not mentally healthy. So you have to balance your safety with your risk. And I think children aren't out enough. And I know, there's a good few books on screens and children. And they've noticed in studies, and it's very interesting, that the more physical restrictions on children, as in their radius of activity around their house. So back 30 years ago, the radius of activity for a 12-year-old might have been 3 miles. And now it's about 500 yards. It's much shorter. The radius of activity is really, really, really reduced. And the more physical restrictions on a teenager, the more risks they take online.
That's not surprising. I mean, I went, but you know what? It makes perfect sense because that's part of the impulse of adolescence is to be risk-taking.
You need the risks.
You're going to find your way.
And what these gifted kids, where are they taking the risks? In their brain. They're taking kind of psychological risks. They're pushing themselves. They're challenging themselves. They're going into queer theory. They're really kind of risking their brain. If you follow me, I think that's where they're going. And I can see why, because they're not having any physical risk. There's not enough risk in their life. There's not enough challenge because it's indoors, screen-based, and they feel the need to kind of push out.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard others talk about this, but in my experience, the kids who develop ROGD are usually not highly athletic kids. I think there's some kind of risk that is done when we are physically pushing our bodies in a certain way. But if you don't really push your body beyond its limits, what's next? I'll push my brain, I'll push my ideas, I'll push my identity, I'll push my presentation. So I do think that need for kind of pushing boundaries exists, whether kids have the opportunities or not. And the last area of overexcitability that we haven't really talked about is the sensual overexcitability, having to do with the 5 senses. So these are kids who really appreciate beauty. They might crave like physical pleasure, but I see more often a sensitivity kind of in a negative way. So highly sensitive to certain textures, smells, sounds, kids who can't really tolerate like loud noises, like a tactile sensitivity to the way clothing feels. So, in those cases, if there's a child who feels overstimulated by the physical environment, they probably don't want to take physical risks. Like, I agree so much with you, Stella, that kids need to be out there experiencing the three-dimensional world. But if there are kids who feel, like, oh, I can't go outside because it's too hot, or I don't like the smell of, I don't know, some kind of thing outside, and they're just indoors all the time, they're going to take different types of risks if the sensual capacity is overloaded easily.
Well, yeah, and more than that, there's been a societal shift since the 80s, and I studied it in depth in that first book, Cotton Wool Kids, where, stranger danger got overstated, very badly overstated, and it made an awful lot of parents very scared. And they've even, there's some great podcasts on it, they've even identified which was the first kind of stranger danger that kind of hit America really hard. Yeah. And from that, the children's physical freedom got very restricted. And as it got restricted, it got further and further restricted. And as it got restricted, a multi-billion industry was growing on screens at the very same time. And now, as a result, we have an awful lot of obesity, and we have an awful lot of very physically restricted children who don't want to go out because they haven't yet. They're like the caged bird where the window is open and the bird doesn't want to go out because they're afraid to go out because they've been led to believe outside is fearful, it's scary, it's too big and intimidating. And those children these days don't want to go out. They want to go on their screens because that's where they're comfortable. And they don't know what they're missing. But I know clients have told me, my friends are better online, I'm better online, and the sex is better online. And they've never actually kissed or had any fumbles because they haven't been willing to go there physically. They'll only go there through the shield of a screen. It's a restricted life, and they don't know what they're missing. And it's a really frightening combination of what's happened. And put a gifted kid into the middle of all this, and you're really getting, of course they feel awkward because they are gifted, they are alone, they might feel physically challenged because they know they're psychologically challenged, that they've developed their intellectual brain and they mightn't have developed their physical side of their life, and so they're afraid to meet people from the opposite sex or people from their own sex. They're afraid to develop their sexual body because their sexual body has never really been to the forefront of their life. Their own body, their physical body hasn't been something that they're proud of. They're disconnected from it and they stay screen-based with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we talked about the physical side, and at the beginning we were talking a little bit about the intellectual side and this kind of playing with new ideas. And I'm thinking about, the programs that do cater towards these types of exceptional kids, they're seeing really high numbers of trans-identified kids. I mean, I've talked to lots of parents who they've reported that, more than half of the girls in their daughter's school identify as trans. I mean, more than half, and I wonder if there's a similar thing happening in Ireland too, when people do address giftedness or exceptionalism.
Only enough there is. There's only really one that I know of. Maybe the people will know more, but there's only one centre. It's called Centre for Talented Youth, and an awful lot of kids who've come to me have been there, and it seems to be a really good program, really interesting program, science-based. It's set in a university, and it's only very intelligent, talented kids that go there. However, there's a huge amount, I shouldn't say however, it's something I've noticed that an awful lot of children who are trans-identified have gone there. And they have things like Trans Tuesday, whether it's among the kids or elsewhere. And people, maybe there's a lot of emphasis on queer theory. And I'm sure those concepts are fascinating for children of this generation. However, it's been very noticeable to me in Ireland that there's the gifted kids, and funnily enough, they have concepts that are really kind of focused on gender issues. It feels like wow, the only centre I know, you know what I mean? So it's an interesting combination that I've noticed, and I think it's a fabulous centre. I think it obviously does some really brilliant programs, and I doubt it if it's isolated. I'd say it's all over UK and America, similar scenario.
Yeah. I know of some summer camps that parents have sent their kids to, and they didn't know that this was going to happen, but they had like cross-gender Saturday or something, where all the kids were told to kind of dress in opposite gender clothing. And, to be honest, if this was in a different context, I would think that's really great. I think it's great for kids to, be willing to, try on something different or experiment with something different. But given the context that these are kids who are actively playing with identity and they don't understand biology, I think that's a very slippery slope and tricky. So it does seem like a lot of programs that cater to a certain parent demographic and a certain student demographic are really actively playing with these categories and these gender roles and gender identities in a very explicit way.
And maybe it's because I would say it's because they enjoy new ideas and queer theories and new ideas. So bring it on and they want to explore it. And now it's kind of run. It's not just queer theory; it's critical theory, I think, and all the kind of theories around.
What's gender identity? It's the gender identity theory, I think.
Okay. Yeah. And I can see why all new ideas are interesting for intelligent people. So they play with them, and if you play with them, I think it's great. I think it's really interesting to expand ideas. And I think it's also very interesting to delve into philosophy and to delve into music and to delve into art. I think delving into one aspect is quite narrow-minded. I think so long as it's balanced with all the others, it makes it massive and really, really interesting and rich.
Yeah, I think in the sense that I get is that in gifted education, there tends to be a desire for novelty and cutting edge and new theories of learning and new theories of how to educate these kids. And frankly, gender identity is so cutting edge. I mean, I wonder if we're starting to teeter into something different. It's not so cutting edge now, but I think these programs probably quickly get on board with the gender identity concept because it feels cutting edge and it feels revolutionary and it feels so new. Though my opinion is that it really lacks existential depth, which I think we were talking about earlier. This is what intelligent, exceptional young people crave. So I wonder if they're actually falling short.
Yeah, and if I knew a child, and I know many of them who are very gifted or exceptional, and they're hitting the kind of stormy seas of 11, 12, 15, 16, the biggest gift you could give to them is what you identified, which is depth, passion. That's where you'll feed them. That's where you'll nourish them more than anywhere else.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens. This podcast is partially sponsored by RIME, Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics. RIME is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
If you found value in our show, please review us on iTunes and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Just go to our Linktree. That's linktr.ee/widerlenspod.
Our discussions are for educational purposes only and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.